Yo, what's going on, Headliner Nation? Kyle back with the Fantasy Headliners. Today's video is all about Cam Akers, breakout or bust. What are we going to be getting from him in 2021 if we use a fantasy football pick on him? I've got some pretty interesting stats from last year, and I'm going to be putting them up toe-to-toe with another running back to see whether or not he could end up being, who knows, maybe our Manscaped must-have, maybe a Manscaped must-avoid, whatever it may be. Make sure you head over to manscaped.com, code word headliners while you're there. Any purchases you make, 20% off, and you're going to get free shipping. Make sure y'all welcome Manscaped back as an official sponsor of the Fantasy Headliners here in 2021. And also, down in the comments, the link to our website. Go pre-order your fantasy football draft guide for 2021. It's going to be out in less than a month, and it's over 600 pages, again, of pure fantasy football bliss. So let's hop into it, ladies and gentlemen. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. Let's talk about Cam Akers. With Cam Akers last season, again, I don't want to give it away, all right? I don't want to give away quite yet what running back I'm putting him up against, but we will see here in just a moment. So let's talk about Cam Akers. 145 rushing attempts last season, 625 yards, average 4.31 yards per attempt. Now, remember last year with Cam Akers, he didn't really get going till the end of the season, right? It was week 13 before he had like his real big volume game. Leading up to that point, he was inactive twice. He had 2 games with no carries. So that's something I talked about in a video earlier in the offseason when I talk about recency bias, because really the biggest information that we have to work on with Cam Akers is what he did really from week 13 through the playoffs last season. So those numbers in that short a span, not bad whatsoever, right? What about some of his other per touch stats, okay? Yards after contact, the dude had 410 rushing yards after contact. His yards after contact per attempt sat at 2.84, and he avoided a total of 21 tackles last season. So Cam Akers putting up some pretty decent numbers that, you know, we talk about here a lot in the Fantasy Headliners, especially myself and my dynamic running back rating. You know, these fighting for extra yards and things like that. I love to see that in running backs. What about some of those big plays last year? Last year, he only had 12 runs of 10-plus yards. He only had 5 runs of 15 or more yards, and he had 2 runs of 40 or more yards. So those stats right there, you know, those really are more volume stats, okay? So when you look at those stats right there, if he would have gotten more volume, if he would have been touching the ball more often earlier in the year, those numbers probably go up, correct? So I don't want to hold it against him too much there. What about his work in the red zone? Okay, what about his work in the red zone? You know, 31 total carries in the red zone, but only scored 2 touchdowns in the red zone and only had 1 touchdown inside the 5. In fact, last year, Cam Akers only had 2 total touchdowns throughout the entire regular season. So when you look at those numbers there, I mean, there was one guy last year that we harped on pretty hard about not being able to convert inside the 5, and that was Clyde Edwards-Helaire, okay? So I think when we talk about, you know, running backs within the 5 on the goal line, last year we hammered Clyde Edwards-Helaire for not being able to get the ball home, especially when he got a lot of opportunities. And Cam Akers, really kind of the same thing, right? Touchdowns inside the 5, didn't really do a whole lot with those, okay? Now, maybe that's not his forte. Maybe that's not what we plan on doing. Last year, he did have 9 attempts. So he only scored 1 time on his 9 attempts with inside the 5-yard line. So personally, I want to see a little bit better of a job like that, especially from a guy, if you're looking at him being like the main guy, right? If you're looking at him being that dude who's going to get a majority of the touches, that's going to get the workload, I want to see somebody that's going to be my stud being able to punch it in from the 5 a lot better. What about in the passing game? Well, Akers wasn't really used too often in the passing game last year. 14 targets, 11 catches, 123 yards. Now, it doesn't really surprise me when you look at those numbers that they weren't super high, right? Because, I mean, you have some pretty good pass catchers there. And I don't think Cam Akers is really going to be used in the passing game much more this season. We'll talk about that more here in a moment. What about some of his per touch numbers when looking at those receptions? His yards per target coming out to 8.79. His 11.18 yards after the catch, or yards per reception, were big. That's a pretty big number. I love to see that. 11.18 yards per reception. When he did get those catches, he was doing a little something with those, right? And then his yards after contact per reception, or yards after the catch per reception, at 8.27. Okay, so yards after the catch per reception, different than yards after contact. Not looking at that. Yards after the catch per reception, 8.27. All right. So not only is he making pretty big plays on those receptions, but he's getting quite a bit of yards after the catch. And I love to see that. I love to see that with Cam Akers. Now, let's go ahead and put some numbers side by side, all right? And the running back that I'm going to be comparing him to is going to be a guy that I briefly mentioned in my video earlier in the offseason when I was talking about recency bias and brought up Cam Akers' name. And in that video, I talked about with recency bias with Cam Akers is that right now people are not drafting him off of anything other than what we saw past week 13, right? Just mentioned that a moment ago. Okay, when you look at Cam Akers last season, week 1 through week 12, okay, he only had one game where he had he only had 2 games where he had double-digit touches, okay? From week 1 through week 12, 2 games, double-digit touches. He had 2 games that he was inactive. He had 2 games where he got no touches whatsoever. And he had another 5 games where he had single-digit carries. Okay? We go to week 13, and then that is where things start to pick up. He goes 21 carries, 29, 15. Inactive in week 16, 21 carries in week 17, 28 in the first round of the playoffs, 18 in the second round of the playoffs. So, yeah, Cam Akers was much better. Much better towards the end of the season. But again, with recency bias, that's what we look at, okay? But I mentioned to everybody, I said, we're drafting Cam Akers based on this, but I don't want anybody to forget about Darrell Henderson. And some of the responses shocked me because there was quite a few people that tried to tell me that Darrell Henderson was garbage and that he didn't matter. And that nobody cared. And he didn't do anything. And Cam Akers was just drafted in the second round. Well, I hate to tell all of you, Darrell Henderson was drafted in the 3rd round the year before. He was drafted 70th overall. Cam Akers was drafted 52nd overall. All right? Ladies and gentlemen, that's not that big of a difference. Darrell Henderson is the guy that I want to talk about a little bit right now. Because the purpose of this video is not to keep you from drafting Cam Akers, okay? I'm not saying we're not going to spend a draft pick on Cam Akers. I'm telling you all that we probably need to be a little bit worried about his upside and that you need to be worried about a potential split backfield or like a 60-40 share in Los Angeles, okay? Last year, attempts-wise, Darrell Henderson came in just a few attempts below Cam Akers. He had 138 compared to Cam Akers' 145. Yards-wise, almost exactly the same. Henderson had 624 yards. Cam Akers had 625. And Darrell Henderson, because he had 7 less carries, averaged just a little bit more on his per attempts than what Cam Akers did, coming at a 4.52 to a 4.31. Okay? So, those were pretty even right there, right? Those are pretty even numbers. When we look at some of the per touch stuff, right? Yards after contact. Cam Akers was a little bit better in that category. 410 to 373, and yards after contact per attempt, 2.84 to 2.70. Very close, right? Very close. Avoided tackles wise, Darrell Henderson was right there with him with 22 avoided tackles. Okay, so keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Some of these numbers are very, very close. Okay, Cam Akers did not blow Darrell Henderson out of the water last year in terms of stats. And Henderson, to begin the season, was a guy that was getting a lot of looks. Towards the end of the season, he got a little bit banged up, ended up going on the IR the final week of the season, wasn't able to play in the playoffs. A couple of weeks before that, he was the starter in week 16. That's when he ended up coming out in that game, and he was a little bit banged up in week 14 and week 15. Okay, so one area that Darrell Henderson did exceed Cam Akers with was runs of 10 or more yards. Okay, runs of 10 or more yards. Darrell Henderson had 20 compared to Cam Akers' 12. That's a pretty big difference. Runs of 15 or more yards. Henderson had 6 to Cam Akers' 5. And runs of 40-plus yards, Darrell Henderson had 1 to Cam Akers' 2. Now, what about work in the red zone? Because I feel like a lot of people are going to say, well, Darrell Henderson, he's not going to get work in the red zone. Cam Akers is going to get those touches. And why do I think some of you are going to say that? Because some of you already have. Some of you already have tried to tell me that Cam Akers is going to get those touches in the red zone. Ladies and gentlemen, Darrell Henderson had 1 more carry within the red zone last year and scored 4 touchdowns on 32 red zone carries compared to 2 touchdowns on 31 red zone carries for Cam Akers. And where it really matters, where we said that we were giving CEH a ton of crap last year, where Cam Akers had to be better, Cam Akers scored 1 time within the 5. Darrell Henderson scored 4 times within the 5. In fact, on carries within the 5-yard line, Darrell Henderson was 4 for 11. 11 carries within the 5-yard line. He scored 4 times. Cam Akers had 9 carries within the 5-yard line and scored once. Okay? So do we come out and say that Cam Akers really is going to be the goal line back this year? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not so sure. Darrell Henderson had more red zone touches than he had. Okay? He also scored more within the 5. What about their work in the passing game? Darrell Henderson edged him out in the passing game a little bit last year as well. Okay? And that's why I'm wondering about Cam Akers' upside this year. Is he going to be a guy that's going to get a ton of touches between the 20s? But then when you get into the touches or into the 20s, then you're looking at Darrell Henderson coming in. Is Darrell Henderson going to get those 5-yard line touches? Is Darrell Henderson going to get those receiving game or get the receiving game work? One thing to keep in mind about this year as well is this Rams offense is probably going to be throwing the ball a lot, right? They spent a lot of money to get Matthew Stafford. And even though they have a really good defense, I would not be surprised to see them airing it out on a consistent basis regardless of score. So last year in the passing game, 8 more targets for Darrell Henderson than for Cam Akers, 22-14, 7 more catches, 6-11. And he outdid him in receiving yards, 159-123. Now on a per-touch basis in the passing game, Cam Akers was a little bit better, 8.79 to 7.23. Not that big of a difference there, right? 9.94 to 11.18, a little bit bigger of a gap. But then the yards after the catch per reception of 10.3, okay? The one thing that I really saw from a difference between these two guys in the receiving game is what they were doing on their average depth of target. So, just to kind of put this into perspective for you last year, okay, Cam Akers had an average depth of target of 4 yards, okay? So, Akers was being looked at out past the line of scrimmage, average depth of target of 4 yards. His yards per target were 8.79, and his yards per reception were 11.18. So then you come out with that yards after the catch per reception of 8.27. But Darrell Henderson Okay, his comes out to 10.13 because his average depth of target was 0.77. Darrell Henderson was being used on those swing routes a little bit more, some of those screen routes, some of those big-time plays that the Rams like to utilize with their running backs. When you've got a lot of players, like when you've got Deshaun Jackson pulling the defense down the field, when you've got Robert Woods doing the same thing, when you've got Cooper Kupp out in the middle of the field, when you've got Tyler Higbee out there, Darrell Henderson could be really dangerous in the passing game this year if those are the same type of looks that they are willing to give him. Okay, those are pretty premium looks. The Cam Akers plays, where he's out 4 yards past the line of scrimmage, to me, that doesn't signal more of like a design passing play. That signals more of like maybe something broke down, or we're putting Cam Akers out in the middle of the field, okay? Darrell Henderson, to me, a little bit more of a design passing play there based on the information I'm looking at. So there you have it, Headliner Nation. I think we've got some pretty interesting numbers there. And again, I'm not trying to convince you not to draft Cam Akers, okay? I haven't really listed too many must-avoids, big names to avoid, other than some guys in the draft guide. Cam Akers is not going to be one of those guys, okay? So I'm not fully convinced at this point that I would even pass on Cam Akers. But I will tell you, if you're thinking about using a pick on him to draft him as a top 12 running back, you're just going to want to be prepared. I don't know if I want him as my RB1. And I don't know if he's going to finish as a top 12 back. He might be more in that maybe like 14 to 16 range, especially if they use Darrell Henderson this season like they did last season. Some food for thought, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit of brain food there to get you thinking about your drafts here in 2021. Don't forget, if you're new here to the Fantasy Headliners, hit that subscribe button, become a part of Headliner Nation today, hit the like button on the video as well, and leave a comment down below. Are you going to be drafting Cam Akers? And what is the earliest that you would be fine drafting him? Let me know those down in the comments below. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get out of here. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and I will catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.